This is Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are joined today by Gary Palmer. He is a member of the House of Representatives from the great state of Alabama. We are in Washington, D.C. today, in the nation's capital. And this is a new job for you, sir. You've been in the Congress. This is your first term. You came from a think tank. How is it? How's your new job?
It's been good. I feel like I was uniquely qualified in regard to the work I'm doing, particularly coming from a think tank for 25 years and then coming up here and then applying policy to the political environment has been interesting.
But it's got to be interesting because, look, when one joins Congress, there are so many issues that are presented. And being that you are at a think tank, you probably became expert in certain areas. And so I'm wondering, are you able to take that expertise and move it into your work in this august body?
I have, but over 25 years, you cover a lot of ground on the policy side, so it's really been helpful, and particularly as a member of the House Budget Committee. Because in the House Budget Committee, you're covering everything. And a lot of opportunity to give some insights and ideas on how to address issues or things that maybe Congress hadn't thought of in a while or maybe didn't even know about.
So just between us, no one else listening and watching, of course, how'd you get House budget in your first year? That's pretty impressive.
I asked.
Well, that's a fair answer. I mean, literally, you just present, you show your expertise.
Well, yeah, it's a process. The steering committee and the committee chairman have some say in it too, and I think my background was of interest to folks.
Of course.
I'm also on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, which there are not many freshmen got budget and oversight, but I'm also on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and the chairman there recruited me to come on that committee, and he had looked at my background, and I'd been an advisor to the Aerospace Science and Industry Task Force in Alabama, so it was a good fit there as well. And then I'm also on the Republican Policy Committee, which is kind of the
think tank.
It's a think tank. Yeah, it's the think tank side.
But you're still focused on home. You're still focused on your constituents. I think about your district, some urban, some suburban, but some rural as well.
Yeah.
And we know that as a result of advancing technologies, what we find is that in the area of medicine, those technologies can overtake a front office. And because of the adoption of a new coding system, it's called ICD-10, there's going to be a huge change in how coding is done. It may seem basic, but it impacts lives every day. And so you're looking to help those nationwide, but specifically in rural areas where they may just have a local doctor's office, and the new coding system is going to wreak havoc.
Actually, Brad, it's going to help doctors regardless of where they are and patients, because ICD-10, that stands for International Classification of Diagnosis. What the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services has done is they've taken these codes, which the doctors have used for years. There are about 16,000 of them. Now there's over 60,000. And they've tied reimbursements to the coding. Well, if you're in a small practice or rural practice, every day you're making decisions about what you're able to spend your money on, to buy a medical equipment or provide another service to benefit your patients, versus having to buy all these new computers and software. And a lot of doctors in the urban areas as well as the rural areas simply were undercapitalized, weren't able to get ready for this, and it's supposed to start October 1st.
Right. My aunt and uncle operate an urgent care clinic in rural California. We're not talking urban California. I mean, they are in the mountains. And I've asked, and they say they spend an exorbitant amount of time focused on billing and coding. And so you want to provide some relief to my aunt and uncle and other folks.
Well, if this bill passes, it would create a 2-year grace period so that CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, will not be allowed to withhold reimbursements. And if you look at the patients in most of the rural areas, the vast majority are Medicare and Medicaid. So this is going to be huge for continuing to provide those people with access to a doctor or a hospital in rural areas.
So over that 2-year period, though, are these offices, these physicians' offices, going to be encouraged, incentivized to get with the program, because in the end, they need to get with the program, correct, sir?
It's coming in, and they've got 2 more years to get up to speed.
I also think about rural areas with beautiful creeks and lakes and rivers running through them.
I grew up like that.
Exactly. And for better or for worse, we as Americans want to make sure that our rivers and lakes and creeks are kept healthy and safe and clean. But there is some concern, and this is bipartisan, by the way, that the EPA is moving into a regulatory area for little local rivers and lakes and creeks that could be overstepping what both Democrats and Republicans would like to see. Talk to us about what's known as the Waters of the United States rule.
Well, the EPA has decided that they have the authority to define what are the waters of the United States, and that definition could literally extend to the water that pulls up in your backyard after a hard rain.
Oh my.
Or the water in a ditch, because that water will drain from your yard into a ditch, that ditch will go into a creek, that creek will go into a river, and there you have it.
Okay.
It's a navigable water.
Right.
And it's going to be one of the most expensive environmental regulations ever imposed on the country.
So as we speak today, the EPA has promulgated this rule. They're planning on marching forward.
They're going forward with it.
But look, you and many members of the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, are looking to actually provide a legal definition for what would be classified under the Federal Water Pollution Control Act for these purposes.
Well, what Congress needs to do is to take back responsibility for these rules, because they're really not rules, they're laws. And the Congress is the only body that constitutionally can pass law. So I think what we need to do is to say to the EPA, not only on redefining and the waters of the U.S. and writing new regulations, is that any regulation that the EPA puts forth on the waters of the U.S. has to be passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the President. Same thing.
Is that appropriate? And I ask you as an expert,
as
a think tank, in terms of administrative law, because look, in the end, you could be overwhelmed with EPA laws coming at you. I mean, how do you create a situation where it doesn't become so overburdensome for the Congress?
We can set a requirement that there's an economic impact evaluation, and everything over a certain amount, plus or minus a certain amount, would be brought forward to Congress. Need to do the same thing on greenhouse gas emissions. EPA has stepped, and the other part about this is EPA has stepped way out of bounds from what the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts required. When the Clean Air Act, which passed, I think, in 1970, was passed as cooperative federalism. What that meant is that Congress would pass a law, EPA would write the regulation, they'd send that down to the states, and the states would implement it, and they had great flexibility, broad latitude in how they did it, as long as they met the standard. Well, that's not what's happening now. EPA is making the rules as they go, and they're imposing it without regard to Congress and without regard to the states.
So with regard to the Waters of the United States rule, since you do have this bipartisan support to reevaluate how the phrase is defined, where do you go from here? Do we have a president that is not supportive of this legislation? Do you have a sense of the momentum on it?
Well, what's going to happen is you're going to have states, attorneys general, and governors filing suit in court. And I think that the courts will block a lot of this.
Okay.
And it's going to lie in limbo until after the next presidential elections. That's just my opinion. I'm not telling you that as any strategy or plan. That's just what I think is going to happen.
His name is Gary Palmer. He is a member of the House of Representatives from Alabama. My name is Brad Pomerance. This is Charter Local Edition.